So the of diversity in children's literature isn't new, which is why we felt that it was important to kind of take a step back and look at some important dates and organizations involved in the history. So in 1965, Nancy Lyric published her study of a survey of 5,206 children's trade books published between 1962 and 1964, and she found that in these books only 349 of them included one or more African American characters, which averages out to be about 6.7%. Also in 1965, writers, teachers, editors, illustrators, and parents established the Council on Interracial Books for Children, and the purpose of the council was to promote and develop children's literature that reflected our multiracial society. So the Cooperative Children's Book Center, also known as the CCBC, which is located at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, began to track statistics about the diversity in children's books in 1985. And from that research, Lee and Low, which is the largest multicultural children's book publisher in the United States, published the Diversity Gap in Children's Books graphic, which we have up here, that it reviewed the past 18 years of publishing in 2013. A year ago, in March of 2014, the New York Times Sunday Review published two op-ed pieces, one by author Walter Dean Myers and the other by his son, author-illustrator Christopher Myers. And in both of these, they bring up the same issues that Lyric had 50 years prior.
Okay, now that Melissa has talked to you a little bit about the history of the lack of diversity in children's literature, I'm going to talk to you a lot about the beginning of the We Need Diverse Books campaign. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about what sort of preempted it, or sort of was the precursors. Specifically, in April of 2014, there was an announcement by BookCon, and BookCon it's a part of the Read Pop family. Read Pop presents a lot of events that you're probably familiar with, Comic-Con and C2E2, so and also Book Expo of America. So they had made an announcement in early April that they were going to present a panel called Blockbuster Reads, and the panel was going to have the authors who dazzle kids on it. And the panel's makeup was 4 all-white male authors. There was no women or anyone who was diverse on the panel. And so after that announcement occurred, an uproar went on in terms of Twitter and social media. So what happened is that there was a conversation between Melinda Lowe and Ellen O. These are two children's authors. And they had a Twitter conversation, and they basically were lamenting the panel makeup, but also lamenting the fact that diversity in children's literature has been an ongoing issue for 50 years. So what happened from the conversation was they determined that to make any change, they needed to create some type of action. So about 22 authors got together and decided that they were going to create a social media campaign to put BookCon, Read Pop, and anyone who was presenting a conference on notice that diversity mattered and that it needed to be in the conversation in terms of panel makeup. So what happened was they put together their plan for a 3-day campaign, and the 3-day campaign was to go on May 1st through May 3rd. The first day of the campaign was going to be a call to action where they wanted everyone who supported diversity in children's literature to post a photo, and on the photo they wanted the person to put "We need diverse books because," and so the person was going to fill in what their specific reason was. So they wanted this to go on to any and all aspects in terms of social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere possible to put this out. And so the first day was May 1st, but this campaign had already gone viral prior to the start time for the campaign to launch. By about 10:45 of that morning, the campaign already had 27,000 tweets from about 9,000 users. So the second day of the campaign was called, basically was the conversation. They were going to have a Twitter chat, Why Diversity Mattered. Again, they were going to use the hashtag We Need Diverse Books. The third day of the campaign was called Diversify Your Shelves. And what that was is for people to put their money where their mouth is. There's a lot of conversation, but they wanted people to go out and buy diverse literature, post those photos on Twitter or social media, and also to go to your local library and check out diverse books as well. So that sort of gives you what the campaign was. the campaign was a smashing success. This campaign was all over the news, it was in magazines, but the key numbers in terms of Twitter that we want to talk about is that the campaign generated 107,000 tweets. That was tweets and retweets. 31,000 unique users sent a message about We Need Diverse Books. Also, 162 million Twitter timelines had a delivery about this hashtag. So now that I've talked to you a little bit about what started the We Need Diverse campaign, Melissa's going to talk to you about what happened after May 3rd.
So, as a result of the campaign, on May 8th, BookCon decided to add a panel called The World Agrees, We Need Diverse Books. The panel, which was held on May 31st, included 5 members from the We Need Diverse Books campaign, along with several authors, including Jacqueline Woodson, who won the 2014 National Book Award for her book, Brown Girl Dreaming, and also Grace Lynn. On May 14th, they posted their mission statement, and then on July 28th of 2014, they announced a filing for a nonprofit organization.
Okay, now what we want to talk about is a little bit about the research that we did as it relates to the campaign. We had taken last fall a African American children's literature course, and over the course where we talked about the development of African American children's literature, one of the key things that kept popping up was we had gone from stereotypical representations to more better representations in terms of how African Americans were portrayed, but what we kept coming up with were social justice issues were popping up in terms of how the literature was getting out, and also issues in terms of the representation on bestseller list or the selling of African American literature. That was something that throughout the course of the class we talked about. So what we wanted to do in terms of looking at research for, this was put together for GSLIS, we wanted to think about social justice, but also literature and sort of a specific, lens in terms of digital activism. And so what we wound up doing was examining how We Need Diverse Books had utilized Twitter. Also, they utilized other forms of social media, but specifically Twitter, to see, how they used it to build supporters or to speak or communicate with their followers. And so what we wound up doing was using content analysis to examine a specific corpus of tweets. And because we started working on this in the fall, we did not have access to the tweets from the original campaign that went through May 1st through May 3rd. So we looked at tweets from November 1st through December 1st through January. So what we wound up doing was examining those tweets and specifically just looking at the ways that they communicated. And we were able to, in searching for other research that sort of related to social justice campaigns and literature or publishing, really did not find a lot in terms of that. What we were able to find was things from politics, also football, sports. And also there was one article about how a British company had used social media to promote two new books that were being published. So there was not really a lot that specifically fit into this category. We were able to find some communications research that was helpful in terms of looking for frameworks. So what we found was that there were 3 major categories that we could sort of use to describe how We Need Diverse Books had used Twitter. Specifically, they had used Twitter in 10 different ways, and that's sort of what's here on the slide. The first major way was information. Basically, this is a form of one-way communication to their supporters. So they did a lot of news and information, but also they also used it as a format to introduce supporters, but also the general public to diverse authors. So one of the key things that they did was they would post what they call diverse voices. So they did spotlights on authors, but also illustrators. And that was something that was fairly regular for them. The information category was their largest in terms of the number of tweets. The second category is community, and this is where they were trying to build relationships, be social, nurture relationships. So the categories there are giving thanks and recognition, upcoming events, notices, reply messages, and solicitation of responses. And specifically for We Need Diverse Books, a lot of their tweets in terms of the community section were on thanks, but also congratulatory messages. But the last category is action. And this basically was where they want people to do something. This is the second most tweets in terms of what they sent, this category. Specifically, they did a lot in terms of fundraising. So they actually had a hashtag campaign that was going on during the period of time that we examined tweets. And so what we found was they did a lot in terms of trying to fundraise. Their fundraising campaign generated about $320,000, so it was fairly successful during this time. But there were a lot of tweets here, and one of the ways that they used Twitter specifically was they used it to sort of support that campaign, but they offered a lot of perks for followers and users. So that sort of gives you an idea in terms of the content of what we found. There are other areas that we could look into in terms of this specific corpus, but in the course of this project, we have now come upon the tweets from the actual May 1st through May 3rd. So that is something that is definitely worthy of looking at further. And I guess just to end our presentation, what I'll say is never underestimate the power of a small, committed group of people to make change. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? Cyan, and please wait for the mic. Make sure you have the mic so we can broadcast.
When you come up with measures for the number of books that are about diverse children's literature and the number of books that are not, I mean, the protagonists are white and so forth, how do you classify those books in which there is no explicit race indicated?
That was my question.
Do you classify them as non-diverse, or do they form a category on their own?
The measures that we used came from the the Cooperative Center for Children's, CCBC, at the University of Wisconsin. And so those are the categorizations, are the ways that we looked at the literature. We didn't specifically go through it. The question that you ask is a good one. I honestly can't answer you in terms of what they do with that. The way that they do the categorizations is African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic, Latino Americans, and then they also do, I think, LGBT as well. Those are the specific categories that they use. So I can't answer your question. I think it's a good one, but I'm not sure in terms of how they make that, how they categorize those. So it would be worthy of me to look at it a little bit further, but I can't answer.
Christine, would you grab a mic and ask your question, please?
Yeah, I think it's.
There you go. You have a spare mic.
I think it's really striking that there's the brouhaha in 1965, and then here we are, so much later, when people were sort of gathering together for this particular push. There's that specific event of the American Bookseller Association presentation, but when they're doing, clearly there's been 50 years of this, were there other sorts of events or statistics or whatever that people were sort of, that were sort of precursors of this?
There were several different things that I guess that have occurred. One of the big things, I guess, or one of the things that has gone on is that if you've gone to any ALA conference or other conferences that relate to literature, there's generally a panel or there are generally discussions about why there is not any diversity. And there have been, we mentioned Walter D. Myers' op-ed that was done in March of 2014. He wrote an op-ed in, I don't know if it was March or April of 1986, where he addressed the same thing. And in that specific thing, he talked about how he thought that there were going to be leaps and bounds that had been made during this time. And what he talked about was how there had been a huge increase in terms of African American literature that had been published, but then it sort of went back the other way. And so if you look at the numbers from this past year from the CCBC, for African Americans, there was a huge increase in terms of the number of books about African Americans, but also the books by African Americans. It was an increase over the previous years, but we're still only talking about 5% about 2% buy. So we're not really making a huge strides here. For Native Americans, the numbers have, I think, really gone down in terms of the numbers there. So there were a lot of events in terms of thinking about ALA and conferences, but also the Children's Book Council in 2012 created their own diversity committee. And so one of the things that they talked about was that they were going to try to work with schools and work with colleges to try to increase diversity. They also have put together a list on Goodreads where there are a list of, 500 or so diverse books. So that's something else that had already happened. But there have been several other, things that have been going on in terms of conversations. Rudine Sims Bishop has written extensively about books as windows and mirrors for children, and about how children need to see themselves reflected within the literature that they read, but also they need to have literature so that they can learn about others. So there have been a lot of people who've been pushing this, but there have also been a lot of excuses that have been put out in terms of why we don't have diversity in literature. Some of those are minorities don't read, they don't buy literature. There also has been, a big one, there are no authors. And so one of the things that we did not cover in the presentation is that there were a lot of contests and awards that were set up, but now we only have one left by Lee and Low book publishers, where they award a minority author with the public. Basically, they get, I think, $1,000 or some amount of money, but they also get a chance to have their work published. Well, Lee and Low has just added a new award for there are 2 books in print where they are giving money for someone who writes in the science fiction or fantasy area. With We Need Diverse Books, there are going to be some new awards. So they've named an award after Walter D. Myers, which is going to start being given, I believe, in 2016. It's going to be to an author who publishes a diverse work this year. Also, they're going to give a grant in his name. So there have been a lot of different things that have gone on, but the things have not carried out. We mentioned the Council on Interracial Books. They also were in establishment in the 60s, but they ended in sometime in the period of the 1990s. That was, from what I've read, a controversial organization in terms of there was people who supported them and people who did not. But that organization did a lot in terms of looking at stereotypes in literature. They created, I think, a top 10 or top 15 list in terms of what you look for in terms of stereotypes and racism in children's books. But they also touched on a lot of different areas in terms of diversity and making it clear. But they put out a bulletin, which basically went out to a lot of people. But that organization has, ended. So basically, I think one thing that would be interesting is to look at the momentum that they had and sort of what they did as compared to We Need Diverse Books in their start, and sort of see, what the comparison and contrast are. That was one of the things that we talked about in looking at how social media played a different role as opposed to them sending out newsletters or going out and giving speeches. So there's the time has changed, but it would be interesting to look at sort of the methods and sort of how they have gone, but also what is the trajectory for We Need Diverse Books, because they're going to have to continue to raise money in order to continue to be around. They've got a lot of initiatives that are going on, but what is that trajectory? Is it going to meet the same, end as CIBC?
Illinois.